This is Andy Revkin of the Columbia Climate School, recording an interview with the authors of a new paper that's getting a lot of attention appropriately about the human climate niche and how climate change is changing where people can live without a lot of interventions that come through air conditioning and all the other things that come with prosperity. The world is deeply divided in terms of climate vulnerability, and climate change is a force to be reckoned with, and that hasn't been reckoned with yet. I'm here with Tim Lenton, who's a professor of climate change at the University of Exeter, and Ashish Ghadiali, who's a visiting research fellow at the University of Exeter, and a filmmaker and involved with very deeply with the justice questions related to the climate challenges that humans face. It's good to have you both here, and thank you for taking the time. Maybe we'd start with just your quick impressions of what you see as the most important findings here. Maybe Tim first, on the from the climate science perspective, and then Ashish.
Well, we just set out, Andy, to calculate, okay, what is the human cost of global warming in a simple overarching way of trying to get a helicopter view of that. By that, I mean, rather than fixating on an economic cost, because economists have a habit of valuing the rich more than the poor because the rich have more to lose, and valuing those alive now more than those alive in the future because they like to discount the future. And we took an idea that several of us have developed already, that is the distribution of human population density, which we might think of as human flourishing, with respect to climate, average temperature and average rainfall, shows a very conserved pattern over history. And there's a clear kind of main peak of human population density, a secondary peak at higher temperatures. And we're able to use that as a sort of aggregated way of saying, okay, where is it good to live? Where is it less good to live? And then we can look at future projections, essentially, of population projections are done surprisingly independent of any considerations of climate change, but that at least allows you to cleanly compare the projected future distribution of population density with respect to climate with what we call the niche, the highly conserved past and present distribution. And the headline result is that we find where current legally binding policies are taking us, which is about 2.7 degrees centigrade global warming, will put about 2 billion or more people out of the hot end of the climate niche into unprecedented high temperatures. You get an even bigger number of people who are placed into climates that, by all experience, would support a lower population density. That number could be as big as 40% of the future population under current policies. But on the plus side, if we could and would do the decisive things to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C, we can reduce the number of people exposed to extreme heat by a factor of 5, down to something like a slightly more manageable but still considerable 400 million. Yeah. The one thing we really, Ash and I, were also concerned about is, well, which 2 billion or 400 million, who's taking the hit here, and also, who's got greater culpability or responsibility for it. And surprise, surprise, the hit is taken overwhelmingly by the less well-off who emit less greenhouse gases and are in the hot parts of the tropics. And of course, the responsibility lies more with the richer people in cooler parts of the generally mid-latitudes.
Right. Yeah, I first wrote about the climate divide when I was at the New York Times in 2007, a pretty long package where we had reporters in different parts of the world giving vignettes on the differential vulnerability and responsibility for emissions, vulnerability to climate hazards. And that picture is just amplified in recent years, which takes us to Ashish, your kind of focal point here. Describe again how this plays with your concerns around injustice, justice, equity, flows of finance and the like.
So, I mean, I mean, in the sense, the results, like, speak for themselves. We're the results that we've seen, describe the possibility, if current policy scenarios play out, of 2 billion people displaced outside the human climate niche. That's and that's I guess it's a profoundly racialized distribution, in which we see the possibility of 600 million people in India displaced outside the climate niche, 300 million in Nigeria. And as you say, like the kind of the resilience of populations where there is likely to be that that sort of those dangerous levels of heat, follows a kind of a history, or a kind of history and a geography of the kind of that kind of speaks back to histories of empire, of the plantation, of a kind of global inequality that is currently supported by an architecture of debt, and so those dynamics of vulnerability that are kind of mapped out across along those heat maps are really kind of reinforcing inequalities that have been historically constructed over hundreds of years now.
So there's been a video produced that's partially a summary of this idea of a human climate niche and the consequences as global warming changes that niche. So I'm going to just play the video, and maybe Tim and Ashish, you can weigh in on what we're seeing. Here we go.
So first, we're seeing in the red and the green the gradation of the climate niche, what's bad in red and better in green. And in purple, we're seeing places pushed out about to unprecedented hot average temperatures above 29 degrees C. And this is a 1.5 degrees C globally warmer world. So there's already a significant expansion of those extreme heat regions. But in a minute, we're going to roll back in a 2.7 degrees C warmer world, which is where current legally binding policies are taking us. And you can watch those extreme heat regions expand. Maybe let Ash talk about that.
Yeah, certainly.
I mean, it kind of speaks for itself, as you see much of India covered, and then much of West Africa.
Right along the equator there. And
yeah. And we'll see a big chunk of Brazil, but not a very populated chunk of Brazil. And what's going to happen next is we're going to roll back once more around the world and replace the niche underneath with human population density underneath, and keep the purple as a sort of see-through filter, just so you can see where the extreme heat regions intersect with very high population density. So there in Nigeria, for example, and West Africa. And in a second, the real shocker is India lighting up with 600 million people under the extreme heat conditions in this possible future world.
And again, that which scenario is that future world? That's the 2.7.
Yeah, so that's actually where the best guess estimate is of where we're heading under current legally binding policies. Of course, countries have brought to the table net zero pledges and other propositions, voluntary, nationally determined contributions, and so on and so forth, that if they were all followed through on, would get us in a better world, a less hot world. But will they be followed through on if they're that's the big question, of course.
Right. And now let's talk about the reactions to this so far. We saw the Guardian story a minute ago, but what's generally, you were saying earlier that there's a bit of a sense of a different interpretation of the results depending on where in that globe you are situated as a media entity. Ashish, what's your take on that?
I mean, it's very early days. I mean, but yesterday we obviously had big early responses from from the top, from the Guardian, from Forbes, from France 24, and the story I think that was coming out through that was one about possible displacement, exposure. I kind of noticed this morning that the Times told a story of, that was kind of leading on the likelihood of migration in these scenarios, and then we're just kind of engaging with it now because it's kind of coming in thick and fast. But there's been an extraordinary take up of this story across the global South. Obviously, the kind of that key headline, that refers to India has been picked up, not surprisingly, widely across in the Indian media. It's also been picked up in Ghana, in Singapore, in Vietnam, in Brazil, in Uruguay, in Bangladesh. And I haven't had time yet to kind of analyze the nature of that reporting in detail, but I've noticed that it's not the migration story that leads; it's the exposure story. It's the fact that we're talking about billions being exposed to extreme heat. I think that it kind of really reinforces a lot of where we're coming from when we kind of committed to working on this study now, which was really about going back into that question of 1.5 as a kind of meaningful target. Right, like if you think back to the history of 1.5, as a kind of demand of the most climate vulnerable countries at Copenhagen, there's been this sort of schism between global North and global South countries around what is the pace of climate change, what is the pace of what's the what's the reasonable trade-off between urgency and a kind of a small c kind of conservative approach to the economy that we have right now, for me, a lot of the kind of impetus behind engaging with the study sort of emerged in the run up to COP26, where that question of whether 1.5 was a meaningful goal at all was really kind of in the balance at some point in the build up to COP26, and increasingly we were kind of hearing people sort of talk about it being, there being sort of challenges around cost benefit in terms of 1.5, kind of, and so I guess that's something that Tim and I have been engaged in dialogue over for a couple of years. Like, when people talk about cost benefit, what are they talking about? It seems, for people that are involved in the climate movement, it seems that the benefits of early and decisive climate action, to limit global warming to 1.5 would be of, widespread, dare I say, universal benefit. And I think what is one of the things that kind of, Tim sort of raised and pointed out to me was that the dominant structures of the economics of climate change, kind of rooted in Nordhaus, have been working through models, particularly the DICE model, since the 90s, but even around 2007, there were scenarios coming out of the DICE model that said it would be cost beneficial to do nothing about climate change rather than attempt to hit a target of 1.5. So what we've done in essentially is kind of look for an approach and a methodology that actually starts to give us numbers that enable us to articulate the cost benefit of meaningful and early climate action.
And how do you relate this? One of the things that I was interested to discuss about the paper is the vulnerability knob in climate policy. You have the emissions knob, which is mostly benefit for future generations, given how long it takes for a reduction in emissions to translate to some modulation of significant climate impacts. Vulnerability reduction, I think, probably is one of the key justice imbalances. The adaptation gap, the $100 billion a year that rich countries pledge theoretically as long ago as 2009. And that just at the G7 meeting this week, the rich countries were again saying, oh yeah, we're going to get serious about the $100 billion we pledged to give you starting in 2020. And it just feels like, again, meaningless. There's so many pledges that come in the climate space that seem like just paper and not concrete or in real terms. I want to show you, there's a line from the Guardian coverage, Tim, there where you were quoted as saying, when people are outside the niche, they don't flourish. But I want to ask you about both is like, it's pretty clear that prosperity can expand the niche. And the one, this came to me vividly in 2016. When I was still flying significantly, I was reporting from both Singapore and Nairobi the same year. And it was years later that I went, both of these pictures, I took both of these pictures 85 miles from the equator. And in Singapore, there's Gardens by the Bay, which is this astonishing glass enclosed kind of botanical garden, the biggest in the world. And there's an olive grove there. There are Mediterranean plants growing right on the equator, and in this informal settlement in Nairobi was a completely different picture. So I wonder how much of the niche discussion can be framed also around whether you call it poverty alleviation or prosperity expansion doesn't matter so much. But how important is this along with the emissions questions?
Well, clearly, if you're very rich, you've got quite a lot of options to sort of insulate or isolate yourself from the climate going on outside, to a degree at least, as we see in Gardens by the Bay in Singapore there. Although it is notable that when we look historically at how the niche hasn't changed, there's no particularly overwhelming sense that in the global picture, going through industrialization and having a whole host of new technologies hasn't apparently radically changed our distribution with respect to climate. And I would reflect that some of the rich hideaways that could be in otherwise very challenging climates in the tropics are often parasitic on larger other parts of the world. It's not like they source all of their food and water even necessarily from their locale. So one has to take a systems view. And I sometimes think of them as living on the kind of spaceship Earth within the Earth, but kind of reliant on the mothership of other life forms, including other people and large areas thereof in other parts of the planet. So I don't think of course the rich can isolate themselves and always will try to isolate themselves from proximate trouble. But when you take a macro view, I don't think that's a viable option. We're all on the same planet together. But I do take the point, Andy, that my word, there are some extra means to deal with the sharp end of these changes can be transformational. But here I'm thinking about in those slums, whether it's Nairobi or it's Lagos or it's Kolkata, it's about having more green space as a basic, you might call it technology or nature's technology, to shave off the urban heat islands that's pushing the climate temperature extreme 5 degrees C above what it needs to be. If you just create some more green space, this ought to be like a relatively low investment, high reward governance action, and yet we still don't necessarily see it, as you highlighted. So that's why Ash and I in this project together, Ash has really led me towards the propositions for what would be an effective finance mechanism, not this kind of bluster and bluff about we will finally get round to putting our hand in our pocket for the 100 billion. So we're supporting Mia Motley and proposal on a sort of a new framework for climate finance. But I'll let Ash talk about that.
Yeah, and Ash, I'd like to add one question too, which is significantly, this is increasingly within countries, not just rich, poor, north, south. When was it? Oh gosh, when I wrote my book on the Amazon, 1990, I quoted someone who described Brazil as Bel India, meaning Belgium inside India. It's like there's a Belgium, Brazil, rich, and then there's India. And now India is kind of like that. So there's also that within country question of justice and in terms of vulnerabilities and stuff too. But anyway, if you could get at the point that Tim mentioned.
Well, I think the question that the previous question that you're raising is a really important one, and I think it's not been our focus on this study. I don't think so. I think what we've done is like present in this study this, I think groundbreaking data that also like points towards a kind of a new economics of climate change and a kind of a new way of counting costs. I think that there's a whole field to be explored now of like, well, what does the human climate niche actually mean? What does it mean in terms of governance? What does it mean in terms of policy making? I think in the first instance, the climate niche, so the kind of the provocation you were making was that through modernity, through resources, through investment, the niche that's habitable can expand. And I think Tim was sort of pushing back against that and saying, well, no, the niche is quite a absolute thing, and there's not a huge amount of evidence that humans have ever done particularly well outside it. So I mean, at the first level of governance, the response to the movement in the human climate niche is just to rapidly reduce emissions, right? Like to really pay attention to that 1.5 scenario, the thing that we've dithered about for a decade, now has some data, has this additional data behind it to really reinforce the value of that target. But I think that you are right, that in the meantime, we know that the process of climate governance from now, even with the best will in the world, even with the with progress, around mechanisms for climate finance that could take us way beyond the 100 billion and actually start to put us in the kind of direction of of $1 trillion, or the $650 billion a year that the Motley plan would deliver through the IMF. These mechanisms might start to move us in the right direction, but what this data then starts to point us to is the value of redistribution, right? The value of investment into those front lines of climate breakdown in order to support the resilience of the most vulnerable populations. There was a really important study from the Climate Impact Lab that preceded ours and would be quite interesting to compare alongside it, where they demonstrated that the relationship between extreme heat and mortality wasn't actually an absolute. It kind of the mortality rates tended to soar in places where there was both extreme heat and extreme poverty. Now, the scenarios that we're talking about, describe that scenario, right? Like they describe, right there it is. There's the one, yeah. And so the scenarios that we're talking about describe the kind of a sudden growth of that deadly kind of combination. And I think that climate finance, as well as thinking about mitigation, can very sensibly kind of lay out a pathway to good governance of the decades ahead by thinking about how we invest into vulnerability, something that currently is not on the cards at all at the moment, where countries find themselves exposed. I've given an example of Pakistan last year, where there are kind of various ways to quantify that. The World Bank has spoken about $30 billion in damages, but in human costs, we know of 1,700 people killed, we know of 7 million displaced, we know of 15 million driven into poverty. So this is what exposure looks like, right? Like it's the kind of breakdown of systems at a kind of national and then at an international level, but then in terms of response, the Pakistan has saw $5.6 billion returned through insurance mechanisms, around 9 billion in international aid. The country's entire national reserve is 4.5 billion. So these sums don't add up, and there's a deficit created. And so where climate vulnerability reveals itself, we see countries driven further down. 6 months after that, Pakistan is in great dire kind of danger of now defaulting on its debt repayments, and so we see how that climate vulnerability then kind of leads to a downward spiral that a correct redistributionary financial apparatus could plan for and address and mitigate against that kind of that growing seemingly ungovernable situation.
I want to get to like a next steps conversation next, meaning what could add some heft to this going forward, who could come into the research who isn't on you. The focus here is mostly on exposure as distinct from vulnerability. But before I do that, maybe you could, Tim, and you could walk me through walk the audience through this particular map, which I think is an important one.
So this is just showing on the underlying map human population density from a future world, but one that's kind of in the central projection for population growth. It's a world of about 9.5 billion people, where some ongoing demographic trends have continued. So a lot of the future population growth is in Africa. There's an extraordinary growth of population in Nigeria, for example. And the black diagonal hatching in the top panel is the 2.7 degrees sea warmer world, and we're just adding which under the black hatching are places that have gone to unprecedented average temperatures, more than 29 degrees centigrade. And the lower panel, it's the same story, just for the 1.5 degrees sea warmer world. And what's really crucial is how the intersection of the extreme heat really comes to overlap some major high population densities, and the Indian subcontinent is clearly one of those.
Well, what you were just saying, there's a big difference between
So Chennai probably sits in the grey hatching even in a 1.5 degrees C world, but Calcutta, probably Delhi looking at it, and lots of major Indian cities that would that region is spreading to. And for, say, Nigeria, it's really pronounced as well. It's kind of like it's about 7-fold fewer people exposed at 1.5 degrees C compared to the 2.7 degrees C world. For some other countries, say Indonesia and the Philippines, you basically essentially no exposure in a 1.5 degrees C world, but some really marked exposure at 2.7 degrees C, in the order of 100 million people type of marked exposure, that order of magnitude. So there's so much difference at that hot end. And what we show also in the paper is, okay, this is a crude measure. It's a mean annual temperature threshold, but it does correlate with the kind of temperatures and the heat humidity extremes that can kill you. So it doesn't capture, I don't pretend to capture all of the places that could have potentially fatal dry heat or hot heat humidity extremes. It's clear we miss some of those, and we may overpredict. There'll be some places which have a high average temperature but less seasonal variability that don't get so many clobbering extremes. But we already know in the data that we're picking up exactly some of the same regions that we already see fatal extremes happening in. And I mentioned Calcutta, and I could have mentioned a few other Indian cities where vulnerable people in some regions in heat waves are clearly attributably dying from climate change now as well. You could say climate change combined with urban heat island effects.
Right.
Yeah.
And as you say, with vulnerability.
And I think you're right, Andy.
Farm workers, street cleaners.
Yeah, or even undocked workers in the Southern Valley in California are dying. Unfortunately, a few of them in climate extremes. So this isn't, and then that doesn't even begin to show up on this crude measure. I think the point you make is excellent. A logical next place to go is to try to combine this with established data on vulnerability. So that, you got it there.
I'm showing there are several geographers who really, and disaster researchers who have been so helpful to me as a journalist in recent years, and breaking down what is a straightforward formula. It's climate risk, which is what we all want to reduce. And of course, energy risk, where that is relevant, is a function of the hazard, heat, flood, exposure, which is a big core point of this paper. How many people, how much stuff in harm's way, and then vulnerability. And I keep learning, though, of course, vulnerability is really hard to measure. Yeah. It's not like carbon, where you can have a quotient of carbon. You can.
This is the sort of tyranny of the things we can measure that does pervade science sometimes. But in the work we've been doing as an Earth Commission, we've kind of come up against the same issue, but we're trying to also gently progress in this direction to get some, you can get, even if, all experts will say, look, poverty is not the only determinant of vulnerability. It is at least a significant determinant, as can be age, of course, illness, and so forth. And we do have reasonable, at least country level data on those things. What gets trickier for our study is we've done what we've just been talking about at 10-kilometer grid cell resolution for the whole world. Do we have vulnerability information at 10-kilometer grid cell resolution for the world? Maybe, but not to my knowledge. So I think you're onto something there.
So there are people at Columbia University. There's a group there, CIESIN, CIESIN. They work on this mapping of vulnerability with some NASA grants and the like. They've been doing this for a long time. Here's part of their work. Again, it's with NASA. And sorry. So maybe if I did a follow-up conversation, it would be to get some of these folks together with you all to.
Well, even if we don't have global coverage yet, we can at least do the places we can do, and that will tell us an important story, I think.
Yeah, and they are doing it. They've done parts of Africa for sure. I know.
Right.
It's harder to measure, and there are even remote sensing. There are signals. The quality of housing. You look at an informal settlement, the roofs and stuff. You can start to get some remote sensing data in this mix as well. So next steps again to me.
I guess there's also to add to that, there's also the kind of important work that Antigua and AOSIS are doing at the moment on developing a multi-dimensional vulnerability index. So that's also happening not just in the academic space, but also in the kind of intergovernmental space to actually kind of describe in a more nuanced way what the thing is that we're actually talking about.
Oh, that's really good to know. Yeah, I first wrote about AOSIS when it was formed back, God, how many decades ago? I've been writing about this since the 80s. I'm looking at here it is right here. I'll just see if I can throw this on screen. The benefits of the multidimensional vulnerability index. I'm really glad you mentioned that. And I'm happy to see if we can organize a discussion on that as well.
Cool. Well, if you, I could probably make some introductions if that's useful. Yeah.
I want to bring in I had just thought of this, so give me a second. I'm going to play a little clip from, I think she's part of the Earth Commission, Diana Liverman, is she?
Yeah, she is. Yeah, she's
This is from a show a couple of years ago. And, I have to actually do it a different way. Hold on a second. I think you'll find it highly germane. And it really crystallizes for me a fresh way of encouraging even journalists to think about these issues. Let me just play it. Hold on a second. Present video. She's one of my favorite people in this space.
When we talk about climate risk, some people still just think, oh, it's the probability of a heat wave. But we need to think about risk not as the probability of the heat wave, but as the probability of harm.
I just think that says so much, so succinctly.
In addition to sort of population growth and other factors, poverty is massively important in explaining vulnerability. And we see a lot of parts of the world, even though we've brought millions of people out of poverty, that there are parts of the world where aspects of poverty make people very vulnerable. So if you're a poor person, yeah, exactly. Great example.
That was Hurricane Dorian. The Guardian had, a lot of the media coverage of that hurricane in the Bahamas was very simplistic. It was sort of big hurricane, global warming.
Yeah.
This reporter for the Guardian talked about, well, who was actually dislocated, who was harmed, and they were Haitian. Nearly all were Haitian workers who were in these informal settlements. The name of the informal settlement was the Mud. In other words, it was a place that was prone to flooding, and so we have to think about that dimension of the system as well.
But the work we've done in Mexico and in other regions shows that if you're poor and they privatize your water, it makes you more vulnerable. If you're an indigenous community and somebody steals your land, you're vulnerable. There are so many ways in which addressing basic social welfare can reduce vulnerability, whether it's in New Orleans or Mexico City. So, and we're seeing that right now with the heat wave here. It's the poor who can't afford to pay for air conditioning, who can't afford to insulate their homes, and who are living on the streets or working in outdoors occupations in 115 degrees Fahrenheit.
So there you go.
Yeah. I mean, what I'd love to sort of add to that is that, because obviously the study does make people think about migration, and we. So I think that Diane's points about poverty are really important, and I just think also from an Earth Systems point of view, it's kind of very easy to just start kind of moving people in your imagination. So we talk about relocation a lot. It's like, oh, all of those people are going to need to move from there to there. But actually, where the conversation that needs to really start kind of emerging right now is that we've got, in the same way that we've got a kind of system of governments unilaterally declaring their NDC their NDC pledges, their willingness to commit or not commit climate finance. We're seeing a kind of an intergovernmental conversation fail to evolve because of national boundaries. And then at a domestic level, we're seeing the same response to migration, like the kind of a defensive response. And I kind of think that the conversation about redistribution of resources comes first, but actually we also then need to look at how far the culture of aggressive borders, in the UK they call it the hostile environment, actually is creating an expense that is actually reinforced. Well, it's creating an expense for the host countries that kind of doesn't really go anywhere, but it also actually exacerbates the causes of poverty outside those walls and fences, that are kind of being built and being extended, into other sovereign, countries. So in the UK, there are deals being done with Rwanda, for example, or deportation flights to Nigeria or Jamaica. I think that we need to actually start looking at the way that I think that this data actually can be something that starts that invites us to start thinking about, like, what is that governance solution that's currently in place? Is it working? Is there a kind of more nuanced way that doesn't keep reinforcing the causes of poverty or the reasons for movement in this sort of zero-sum game? So it'd be great to see that as a kind of like further direction of this result that again comes out of that question: what does the human climate niche really mean?
And I'd like to add to Ash's point here, because we're also clearly in a world of land grabbing going on in the global south, to put it bluntly, and that is often displacing people. It's also really restricting the already developed forms of adaptation around smaller scale movements, sometimes a highly effective adaptive strategy. So we've got these shifts in capital, these land grabs, and exercising power by the rich that is further constraining the adaptive response options for the most vulnerable, in simple terms.
Yeah. There's one thing that I still find perplexing, I guess is the word, on this planet. People are tending to be moving into zones of hazard faster than even the hazards are amplifying. There was this paper, part of a bunch of work recently on on flood risk. It was Beth Tellman and others. Study finds global surge of flood exposure is. So we're moving into zones of flood hazard faster than flooding is changing. And this was this paper. And this, in the United States, there's news, more and more people are still moving to Phoenix or whatever, even though they're running out of water. So how does when you wake up in the morning or when you're up late at night, what do you think about when you think about that aspect? And sometimes it's people who are prosperous or poor for whatever reason are moving into areas that there was an American geographer, Pierce Lewis, who when I wrote about Katrina, he wrote a history of New Orleans where he called it impossible and inevitable. And think of that map you're showing, and how does that play for each of you? This reality of demographic, where people tending to move.
Well, those are generally understood by the academics, at least, when it's deliberate migration, to be sort of largely positively driven supposedly by notions of economic opportunity. But if I am ever reflecting on this, I find it sardonically amusing that we're like lemmings, basically, often collectively.
Or there's a Pied Piper of some sort.
Well, I think it's a really interesting fact to kind of raise, that actually just invites us to really look a little bit more closely about how climate change is lived, especially when we're all speaking now in the global north, and the kind of condition of the global north in response to climate change has been to project climate change into a kind of a distant apocalyptic future, one that's sort of beyond imagination, but obviously that's not been, climate has been changing, climates have been changing around the kind of the world that has been colonized, we now call it the global south, over, the experiences of ecocide and of genocide, and, have been the kind of the structures through which the world has been made. And so, even now, if you're a villager, my own family sort of history kind of goes back, first to Mumbai, then to rural Gujarat, and there's a kind of 100-year migration of people looking for opportunity and moving. So if you're living in rural Gujarat and the ground is not yielding food, because then your prospects there as a farmer are not good, and so of course you move to where you have family or where you have contact, which is likely to be the nearest big city. Now, obviously, looking at this from the perspective of the satellite, which is what we're doing, that we look at the vulnerability of Mumbai or Ahmedabad, as being, we can't even see the village that they've escaped from. It's just, but that's not the lived experience of that move, so again, it's like there's a kind of question, the global question, the question of global governance is, if we are able, if the satellite is enabling us to anticipate, like shifts in weather systems, that would mean that it could be desirable to move people, along different lines to the ones that history is currently pushing them along, then that needs to be stimulated, right? That needs to be planned, and there need to be investment strategies. A deal needs to be imagined and put on the table. And we've done that historically. Human beings have made moves like that in progressive moments, and that is the progressive opportunity of our generation. But it's not a scale of imagination that is currently being deployed towards the crisis that we face, and possibly that is because of the gap between the village and the satellite, which in some ways this study points us towards a kind of the rapprochement of,
Beautifully put. I'm sorry, guys, but we're 3 minutes over. I have to do 2 BBC back-to-back interviews, so I've got to go.
No, this was a great start, and thank you both for being on today. Let me just close out with a thanks to. Oh, sorry, I lost Ashish. Sorry. This is a great start. Thanks for taking the time. I know you're both busy. Ashish Ghadiali and Tim Lenton of University of Exeter. I haven't had enough coffee yet. It's morning here. And this is a Sustain Wet recording that will be broadcast later this week. And thank you both for taking the time. And there's lots more to do. Let's see if we can arrange a discussion about bringing in that vulnerability mapping. And I love Ashish's point about anticipatory capacity. How do we work with that too? Receiving cities is one of the concepts that comes up. How do you foster flows that make sense? Thanks again, and good luck with the next steps in your work.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time to talk to us.
Sure.
All right.